This video entry to the Theory of Everything, Physics and Consciousness contest tells the story of when two pioneering neuroscientists ventured into the world of thermodynamics, information theory and computation to do battle with the hard problem of consciousness. What they propose, to the surprise of their peers, is that understanding consciousness is, in fact, to their mind, rather easy. Their revolutionary ideas tell us that experiences spring into our conscious awareness primarily as feelings rather than thoughts. And this all happens for the fundamental reason of helping organisms like you and I decide what the most important things are to do for our body as well as for the survival of our species. Let's take a step back and begin with the topic of why consciousness has become so slippery to study. The hard problem of consciousness posed by David Chalmers in 1995 wrestles with the question of why all our mental processes and physical actions are not happening without awareness. Why aren't we on autopilot like zombies all the time? After all, it's true that so many of the things we do are relegated to automaticity without us being consciously aware. You can walk up the stairs carrying a tray of drinks and listening to this video without noticing your feet on the steps, let alone needing to be aware of the changes to blood pressure and heart rate needed to power you up the stairs. Biologists and neuroscientists have a good understanding of the functional and structural properties of our brain and nervous system in a moving body, and we see that many creatures thrive without displaying the key features of consciousness, such as self-recognition, emotional expression, and social behavior. So how can we explain why there is something it is like to be consciously aware of a mental image or experience an emotion, if so many of the things required to stay alive can happen unconsciously? To answer that in this video, I'll outline a straightforward scientific answer to the hard problem of consciousness proposed by Solms and Karl Friston. For this, I'm relying heavily on their paper from 2018 in the Journal of Consciousness Studies titled How and Why Consciousness Arises. Some considerations from physics and physiology. The main point of this paper is to present the case that consciousness emerges from within our bodies through biological processes that are all aimed at satisfying the thermodynamic conditions for being alive. I also draw from explanations of consciousness found in the book The Hidden Spring, a journey into the source of consciousness, written by Solms and published in 2021. Solms and Friston believe that we've been thinking about consciousness in the wrong way and looking for it in the wrong places. A key insight to remember now as this story in this video unfolds is that Friston and Solms believe that the primary function of your consciousness is not to be aware of the world around you through sight, sound and touch, but rather to preserve the internal conditions of your body. When changes to these internal conditions occur, they're experienced as feelings. Feelings, in scientific terms, are called affect and are guides for our behaviour. Friston and Solms formalise this in mathematical notation by demonstrating how feelings relate to the most fundamental property of living things, that is, their tendency to resist the second law of thermodynamics. So this easy solution to consciousness is really all about going back to basics, our biological drive to stay alive. The setup of the rest of this video is as follows. First, we'll look at Solms' journey to realizing where consciousness springs from in the brain. He has shown that it is not dependent on cortical parts of the brain associated with the higher mental functions of humans. This is a mistake about consciousness that he refers to as the cortical fallacy. Then we'll introduce Karl Friston's free energy principle and show how it links to living organisms' ability to resist entropy, or in other words, their desire to avoid uncertainty and surprise, and test their own hypotheses about their place in the world. This is the whatness that consciousness is aiming to achieve. Finally, we'll move on to the key role that conscious feelings play in the awareness of our internal state for reducing entropy. For this finale, the heroes of the story, Solms and Friston, suggest that the brain prioritizes actions based on the most urgent needs of the body by making predictive computations. These are experienced as feelings and prioritized bodily needs like hunger, thirst, or the urgent need to find your keys when running late for a date. So let's start with the key twist in the plot of the hard problem of consciousness, what Solms calls the cortical fallacy. It's a conflict about where to look for consciousness in the brain. Much of mainstream consciousness research has looked for consciousness in parts of the brain called the cerebral cortex, which is found in humans and other mammals. This is probably a legacy of humans' overconfident and wrong assumption that we're the most spectacular manifestation of all evolution, and that we should base our views on consciousness in ourselves and other organisms from the structure of our big forebrains. In The Hidden Spring, Mark Solms provides several strands of compelling evidence that consciousness exists even in the absence of a cortex. One striking example comes from hydroencephalic children whose brains' cerebral hemispheres are absent to a great degree, and the remaining cranial cavity is filled with cerebral spinal fluid. These children display many features of consciousness, such as wakefulness and emotional expression, even though they are missing the part of the brain, the cortex, which has been the hunting ground for consciousness for so long. But the evidence doesn't finish there. Solms shows that consciousness is dependent on activity in the densely knotted core of the brainstem, which receives information from our bodies. By interfering with the activity of this area, it's possible to interfere with consciousness. A critical milestone in this story is that conscious experiences spring from this part of the brainstem as it receives important information from your body about how well your cells and organs and tissues are doing at the business of staying alive, something that scientists call homeostasis. This is an important move as it suggests that the primary function of consciousness is not so much about registering everything that's going on around you, but rather the purpose of consciousness seems to be to protect your internal state. More details of this evidence can be found in Solms's book, The Hidden Spring. For now, we'll move on to the next part of this story, which provides a modern take on the idea of homeostasis, uniting it with thermodynamics and information theory. For this, we'll bring in the second protagonist of the story, Karl Friston, who has already made cameo appearances on the Theory of Everything channel. Karl Friston helps Solms bridge the gap between noticing the importance of the brainstem in consciousness and figuring out what brains are helping organisms compute about the state of their body in a fluctuating environment, and how this leads to organisms acting in appropriate ways for their survival. So, spoiler alert, this story comes to a climax by defining consciousness as the brain's registering of prediction areas as embodied feelings to help us stay alive. But before we get to that, I'll briefly introduce a principle that Friston is most famously known for, the free energy principle. The free energy principle is a set of conditions that, according to the principle, all living things conform to. It helps us better understand how our bodies and brains work together to maintain their structures and resist the tendency of lifeless matter to gradually dissolve into its environment. To understand the free energy principle, or FEP, think about the difference between something that's alive, like an apple ripening on a tree, and something that's not alive, like the apple after it's falling and started to rot away on the ground. What's the fundamental difference? Well, the apple hanging on the branch is highly organized and has a recognizable structure, which it's able to maintain through time. The rotting apple, conversely, is slowly decaying, losing its structure and merging into its environment. The FEP states that the way apples, and indeed all living organisms, resist dispersion is because they're impelled to minimize surprise and resolve uncertainty to maintain their organised structure. The gap between what you expect yourself to be and the reality of the world around you is what Professor Friston calls free energy. Since this video has been prepared for the Theory of Everything channel and is viewed by people wanting to understand physics, I'm going to read Friston's free energy principle in its canonical form, as stated by Solms in The Hidden Spring. Here we go. A equals U minus TS, where A denotes free energy, U denotes total internal energy of a system, and T is temperature, S is entropy. So, in thermodynamical terms, this means that the free energy of a system is equal to the amount of total energy contained in the system minus the part of that energy that is already employed in effective work and is therefore not free. In other words, free energy is equal to the total internal energy minus energy already employed in useful work to keep the system going. Quoting Solms, what can be simpler? Free energy is what's left when you take away the energy that isn't free, i.e. when you take away the bound energy. According to Friston, the purpose of life is to minimise free energy. So what has the FEP to do with consciousness? Well, we've established that what organisms strive to do is to minimise free energy. Now, can Friston and Solms explain how the brainstem and consciousness achieve this? Well, yes, and the answer requires us to wrap the story up by summarising two principles that are mathematically tractable. One is active inference, which is a way of understanding how brain activity corresponds to behaviour and free energy minimisation. In brief, it characterises the cycle of perception, planning and action in terms of probabilistic inference. The second is arousal or precision modulation, and this is the finale in our story of consciousness, which we experience as feelings in our body that help us to decide and prioritise between different behaviours. I'll attempt to summarise these ideas as succinctly as possible, and please refer to the references at the end of this video for full explanations, as they require us to wrap our head around the concept of prediction and belief updating. But in a nutshell, let's say that throughout evolution, organisms have figured out that it's more effective to run the cycle of predict, act and correct, predict, act and correct, predict, act and correct, than it is to wait around for things to happen, to sense them, and then to react. Said in another way, your brain compares and combines incoming signals from within your body and from the world around you with prior expectations and beliefs to form a picture of you and to predict how best to react. Essentially, how we perceive the world is our brain's best guess of what's out there. And some people have called this a controlled hallucination. We've evolved like this because it's better to use our resources to be proactive in how we interact with the world and the environment through time, rather than waiting to react with it. So think about a typical day for you. You may check the weather forecast and plan what clothes to wear for a holiday and go shopping for food for the week ahead, rather than just dawdle around shivering and sweating as the temperature changes and hoping that you'll stumble across some nuts and berries growing on a tree somewhere at the right time when you get hungry. The brain is there to help us anticipate the future. This view is aligned with a relatively new idea called allostasis, which is an update of the idea of homeostasis to include our ability to predict our needs into the future and act accordingly. Most of the time this works really well for us, and things happen so quickly that it feels like we're reacting to the world. However, the world is unpredictable and our forecasting systems are prone to errors. This becomes apparent with visual illusions, where what we perceive is based on an expectation of what we think should be present. All of our perceptions occur in this way. Returning now to how Solms and Friston present this statistically through active inference and precision modulation, they have several tools in their box. Mathematically, the predictive way that living organisms tend to persist in the face of a world of perturbations can always be cast as a Bayesian process of active inference. The standard expression of Bayesian statistics is as shown. From here, a scheme of predictive coding is developed where a conscious system will depend on something called a Markov blanket, which provides a statistical partitioning of hidden internal states and external states. Think of this as like a cell membrane, which is kind of semi-permeable, allowing some information through. As biologists know, lots of activity happens at this partition in an attempt to sense what's going on outside and to maintain the conditions inside of the cell. In the case of the brain, prediction errors are generated by comparing sensory evidence with prior predictions based upon prior expectations or representations of our bodies in the world. When I pick up someone else's suitcase, will it be as heavy as I expect? What this means from the perspective of neuroscience, as far as we can tell, brain circuits literally do compute probability distributions and make comparisons between the predicted and actual distributions, resulting in computations of posterior probabilities. Friston and Solms go on to associate free energy with the amount of prediction error weighted by its precision. In layman's terms, we can regard prediction errors as newsworthy information and the precision of that information as its reliability. So with all these ideas in place, Friston and Solms say that we can describe any self-organizing system with the dynamics of action, perception, and affect or feeling. Here are shown some of the notation used by Friston and Solms. To bring this story to a final conclusion, we have to ask, why is precision so important for consciousness and feelings? Well, life is complex, especially for us social mammals. Survival for a species is not just about when I'll get my next meal from. For my family to survive, a lot more variables have to be considered in different contexts. Is my hunger right now more important than my grandchild's need to play? Rather than trying to compute relative demands in all predictable situations, which is extremely energy expensive and leads to what is known as combinatorial explosion, instead, brains modulate arousal, which is what computational scientists call precision weighting. The purpose of precision modulating or arousal for conscious awareness is to ensure that conclusions made by prediction errors are trustworthy news. If the confidence in a signal is great enough, then it should be allowed to update the model. Such systems can adjust precision to optimally match the amplitude of incoming prediction errors. Solms and Friston propose that this is consciousness. It's the final optimization process, the optimization of the system's confidence that it's doing the best to minimize free energy. How might we notice this day to day? Well, it's kind of like the sat-nav system in your car that's helping you to navigate your car. The sat-nav tells you when to turn left, to turn right, when you're on the best route to carry on straight, or in urgent situations to make a U-turn. All of the time it's focused on reaching your destination and only alerts you to the important information out of all the possible routes you could take. Likewise, arousal and precision through consciousness make you aware of what's important and what actions to take, and this is experienced through feelings and emotions helping you decide what is important next. How do you select between the most important bodily need to prioritize? How do you choose whether it's more important to eat, drink, cooperate, argue, laugh, or escape a smoke-filled room? The brain computations of these scenarios are experienced as feelings. Quoting from Friston and Solms, starting with thermodynamics, we arrive surprisingly easily at a qualified and agentic subjectivity, one whose most urgent priorities are weighted for a moment, felt and then transformed with the due circumspection into ongoing action. That is what it is like to be anything that it is something it is like to be. So, have Friston and Solms really solved the hard mind-body problem of consciousness? The heroes of this story believe that the hard problem is an issue of observational perspective. Put in another way, it would be wrong to ask how lightning can cause thunder. The answer is lightning does not cause thunder. Both phenomena are caused by electrical discharge. This unitary underlying explanation solves the hard problem of the relationship between lightning and thunder. By the same token, our conscious felt experiences do not arise from the physical basis of biology. Rather, the physical properties that are observed by scientists and consciously felt as embodied sensations are dual manifestations of the same unitary underlying processes. What is seen is not caused by what is felt, but both have hidden causes, the drive to minimize free energy. So, where do we leave Solms and Friston? Is this work complete? No, they're still researching and working on artificial intelligence and consciousness to help us better understand ourselves as humans. I'll finish by saying I hope you continue to enjoy consciously experiencing your felt bodily sensations, and be rest assured that all of these are in service of keeping you alive. Thank you for your attention.